Hello, welcome once again to Bible Talk with Bruce and Becky. It is a windy Wednesday here in Chattanooga. We were going to sit outside to do this, but it blew us back inside, which reminds me, please continue to pray for those who are being threatened by a hurricane in Florida and other areas of the Gulf Coast. But let's go back in time to chapter 40 of Genesis. As we continue to move through the story of Joseph, it looks like Joseph will never get out of trouble in Egypt. He's been there about 2 years or more. He was put in prison and trusted by Potiphar, the chief steward of Pharaoh. But Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him and finally falsely accused him of rape. So he's put in a prison in Potiphar's house where the king's prisoners are kept. But no matter what seems to happen to make things worse, God continues to give him favor. As we read in chapter 39, verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. The Lord showed him chesed in Hebrew, a word that means faithfulness to a covenant promise. And so God keeps his promise to watch over Abraham's descendants, including Abraham's grandson, Joseph. Joseph is put in charge of everything that happens in the prison because the prison keeper could see verse 23 of chapter 39. The light's a little hard for me to read here. And he saw that the prison keeper saw that Joseph was receiving favor from the Lord, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed.
Can you see better?
I can see the book better. I can't see my handsome face as well, or your beautiful features, but let's go with this.
All right.
We're rolling here. Is that what
Yes.
Let's move into chapter 40, which is kind of a bookend for what we are learning about Joseph so far. Do you remember, Becky, what caused Joseph mainly to be out of favor with his brothers?
Well, he kept interpreting dreams, and the dreams forecast that he would be in ascendancy over his brothers.
Ascendancy? I thought he was going to Egypt. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
And his father showed him favor, which never makes you popular with your siblings.
Yes, his father obviously favored Joseph and gave him a special coat that put his status above those of the rest of his brothers. So that caused him to get in trouble, especially the two dreams. I don't know what Joseph's attitude was when he told his brothers about that, if he was arrogant, if he boasted about it, held it over their heads. But he was only 17 years old. I can't speak for Becky or the rest of her family, but when my brothers and I were about that age, we made some really bad choices and decisions. And having taught middle school and high school students for nearly a decade, I know that they often make bad decisions. And I learned in studying development of adolescence that the part of our brain that makes judgments doesn't fully develop until about the age of 25.
I think we mentioned this before.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, we had a little discussion about who got mature first, men or women.
Yeah, let's move on from that. Because you married me when I was 24.
Oh.
Your judgment may not have been fully sound. We'll comment no more. but it's lasted for over 51 years, so it shows Becky's perseverance.
And my age.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I was 24, but she was only 12.
Oh.
No. Let's get back to Joseph. And dreams will figure prominently as the other bookend of this story, the dreams of Pharaoh's servants and the dreams of Pharaoh himself, which changed Joseph's status dramatically. Well, sometime after Joseph had been put in prison, chapter 40, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. We don't know what their offense was, and much to the consternation of modern biblical scholars, we don't know which Pharaoh this is in the history of Egypt. The Bible rarely names any of the pharaohs, and only a later time are any names given. Apparently, it was customary at that time just to give the title Pharaoh and not his name. So we have some trouble fitting this into the history of Egypt, although it may fit pretty well in the time of the Hyksos rulers who invaded Egypt and took over the throne and kept it for a couple of centuries, and they had many foreigners in their government in high positions. It may be that that's the time that Joseph is elevated. But that's just speculation. Let's move on. One night, they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. Maybe we should mention that the cupbearer and the baker are not just menial servants for the pharaoh. They are high officials. And part of their duty is not only to provide baked goods and wine for the pharaoh, but what else do you think they did, Becky, that made them in high position? Take an educated guess.
Oh dear. Well, they might taste the bread and the wine to keep him from getting poisoned.
Good guess. That was a part of their responsibility, to protect Pharaoh from enemies who might try to poison him. And also they had responsibility for hiring the people that worked under them to make sure that they were trustworthy and not a threat to the king. But something happened. We're not told what it was, that they offended the king and he put them in prison. Prisons in the ancient world, even up to the time of the Romans, were not institutions where people were sent to serve a sentence. They were held there until their case was heard and determined. We don't know why Joseph was there so long. It may be that Pharaoh was not interested in a Hebrew slave and let him languish in prison. By the way, it raises a paradox of what the Egyptians believed about their king. They believed that when he began his reign, he was reborn into the status of deity. He became one of the gods when he became the ruling pharaoh. Now, why does that raise a paradox about the cupbearer and the baker, Becky? Dum, 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 dum.
Well, if he's a god, how could he be poisoned?
Ah, good thinking. This woman is really smart, in spite of who she married before her judgment was fully formed. Yeah, it is kind of a paradox that a man who supposedly has become a god has to be protected from being poisoned.
And that he wouldn't know whether or not he was being poisoned.
Right. He seems to have more human characteristics than divine, but we don't have to worry about that now because they're all long dead and gone. But it helps us maybe understand the story, or it raises questions for us. Okay, the two officials, the cupbearer and the baker, have dreams. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, I'm in verse 7 of chapter 40, who were with him in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? They said to him, we have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Joseph lets them know up front that if he's going to be able to interpret their dreams, it will be because God is favoring him and giving him the interpretation. Dreams were very important to ancient kingdoms, so much so that the rulers would have a whole staff of dream interpreters called the magicians sometimes in Egyptian stories in the Bible, or in Mesopotamia they were the magi or magi. It was from that class that the wise men of the New Testament came to visit the newborn King of the Jews. Part of what they did in their training was to study dreams and what their interpretation might be. Some of these dream books from Egypt and Mesopotamia have been preserved down to our time. And you can read in there, they will have sample dreams in different categories and possible interpretations. But Joseph apparently has not studied the dream books, but he believes that God will give him what he needs to interpret the dream. So, Becky, if you will begin reading in verse 9 of chapter 40 and read down to verse 19.
So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me then when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you.
2 quite different dreams and 2 quite different interpretations. Both of them playing on the number 3. That in 3 days they will have their heads lifted up by Pharaoh. And the interpretation plays on that phrase, lift up your head. It originally goes back, I think, to the time when a person approached royalty, their eyes were downcast. They were not supposed to look on the face of the ruler. But if the ruler was favorable to them, he would reach down to their chin and lift up their head where they could see and look him in the face. And that's what's going to happen to the cupbearer. Pharaoh lifts up his head, shows favor, and restores him to his previous position. But Pharaoh adds in talking to the baker, he will lift up your head off of you and hang you on a stake for the birds to eat your flesh.
Mm.
It was not customary in those times to hang somebody in order to kill them. What probably happens to the baker is his head is cut off, lifted up from him. His body is impaled on a stake and left there to decompose, and birds and insects would come and eat his flesh. This was in order to strike fear into anybody who might be thinking to go against the Pharaoh's wishes. The same thing happened with crucifixions in the time of the Romans in New Testament times. Ordinarily, bodies would be left on the cross to be humiliated, degraded, and consumed by the wild animals. The whole idea of these executions is to humiliate the person and to give an example to anybody else not to do anything to offend the ruler. Well, on the third day, as Joseph had said, verse 20, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet, and here's the sad ending to this part of the story, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph had asked a favor. He had been instrumental in restoring this man to his position. But to emphasize how he was forgotten, we're told in somewhat of a repetition, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Boo, chief cupbearer.
Bad guy.
Bad, bad, bad. But the Lord is still with Joseph, and there are more dreams to come. Chapter 41. Becky, read please the first 13 verses of chapter 41.
After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When he told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Is that it?
That's it for now. Okay, Pharaoh has what looked like 2 different dreams, kind of strange. Joseph, in interpreting, will say they're actually one dream with 2 different phases to it. They have the same interpretation. And they're a bit strange. Skinny cows, ugly cows, swallow up the fat, healthy, plump cows. Do cows actually eat other cows?
Not
No.
to my knowledge.
But in dreams, strange stuff can happen.
Corn doesn't eat other corn either.
No, although this is wheat. They call it corn in older English versions, but it would be wheat or barley because they didn't have any corn. What we call corn came from the Americas to Europe and beyond much later than this time. But that's neither here nor there, wherever there is. Notice, by the way, in these stories about Joseph, that occasionally the term Hebrew comes up. He's called a Hebrew slave by Potiphar's wife. The chief cupbearer calls him a Hebrew. Much scholarly ink has been spilled over what the term Hebrew means in the Old Testament. One clue to its interpretation is that it's only used by foreigners about the children of Israel or by Israelites talking to foreigners. So foreigners like the Egyptians would consider the people of Israel and other Semitic people Hebrews, which could mean something like nomads or even hillbillies. They're uneducated, uncultured people who follow their herds.
Hicks.
Yeah, they're Hicks from the sticks up in Canaan. But that's just speculation. We don't have a clear idea of what a Hebrew was to the Egyptians, but it does not seem to be a complimentary term. Easy for me to say. Well, what about the dreams that Pharaoh had? None of his experts could interpret them. I wonder what happened to these experts who failed in their duties that we're not told. I'm going to read on from verse 14, and we're not going to finish this whole chapter today, but we'll read about Joseph being called by the Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. That's the term they use for the prison that he's in. Joseph calls it a dungeon. Maybe it was in the basement of this house of the chief of the guards. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. Okay, Becky, tell us why Joseph shaved before he approached Pharaoh.
He was manscaped.
Manscaped?
He was manscaped.
I don't really know what that
I
term
guess
means.
it was a hygiene thing or custom.
Let's say custom. We know from the Egyptian paintings and murals and other things from the period and after Joseph that the Semitic peoples, like Joseph and his family, like to grow their beards and their hair. They probably even had hairy legs or hairy arms and hands like Esau. But the Egyptians didn't like that. That kind of offended what they thought a person should look like, especially in Pharaoh's presence. Joseph would not only have shaved his head and his beard, but his whole body in order to approach Pharaoh. And he would wear an Egyptian garment rather than garments that he was used to because he wants to please Pharaoh and not offend him by showing up with hair all over. Them hairy Hebrews don't know how to look. By the way, Mesopotamian rulers also shaved their beards. But in Mesopotamia, guess what they did after they shaved their beards?
They wore false beards.
They put on false beards and wigs after they shaved their head to give them an appearance that we may have seen in some of their statues and so on, which don't look natural. But why they shaved their hair and wore false beards, I can't tell you. But the Egyptians preferred to be clean shaven all over. So Joseph prepares himself, In verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is God, not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Knock on wood, Joseph. Joseph shows his faith in God, and he makes sure Pharaoh knows that it's God, his God, who will interpret, and it will be a favorable interpretation. It may be that somehow God has indicated that to Joseph. Notice, by the way, that the chief cupbearer and Joseph both speak to Pharaoh about Pharaoh in the third person. They don't say you, he will give you. That he says they will give Pharaoh. And he will say, Pharaoh had a dream, not you had a dream. It's kind of like looking down when you approach the ruler. You don't address him directly. You talk about him as if he is another person. This is just part of their custom because Pharaoh is different from other people. Pharaoh said to Joseph that he had a dream, and behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass.
I just read that.
No, this is Pharaoh telling
they're
the dream
telling it
to
again.
Joseph. He's telling it to Joseph,
Okay.
who hasn't heard it yet.
Okay.
It's good that you're awake and paying attention here.
Sort of.
Partly awake.
Yeah.
Yeah, but and Pharaoh will give some slightly different details and add some things in what he tells Joseph about the dream. 7 other cows came up after them, verse 19, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. He expands a bit on his dream. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they'd eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Blighted by the east wind. Just to add a little information to this, the east wind was called in that culture, and I think still today, the Sirocco.
Sirocco.
And the fact that it blew from the east meant that it came off the desert. If it had come from the north or even parts of the west, it would have come off the ocean. But this was a hot, dry wind that blew dust. And when it continued for a period, it said that people would often become depressed because this wind didn't let up. And it was so hot that it dried everything out and made everybody miserable. So there you have it. The Sirocco has blighted the ears of the grain. Joseph is about to interpret the dream, but only in the next episode. You'll have to stay tuned or tune in later to get the interpretation. Whatever you do, don't read ahead. I used to tell that to my high school students in hopes that they would read ahead, a little reverse psychology. Read the rest of it, or you may have read it before, but we'll pick up in chapter 41, verse 25 next time. Thank you for tuning into this episode, and remember our motto, don't send money. May God bless and keep you.
Amen.